Good morning, everyone. I wish I could be with you in person today, but I'm actually expecting twins and my mobility is somewhat compromised at this point. But for the next few minutes, I will be speaking to you about a research project that my colleagues Mike Cleland, Amy Richard, and I have been working on over the past months. This project is all around the language of transition. Whether energy transition, low carbon transition, clean energy transition has become a buzzword in the Canadian energy conversation recently. And so in this study, we were interested in two things. First, how do various actors in the Canadian energy community use the term transition? And second, what meanings do these actors assign to the term? And we were interested in these questions, of course, in the wider context of polarization. Is it fair to say that the language of transition has a polarizing or depolarizing effect on the debate? To find answers, we spoke with 42 representatives from 38 different organizations in the Canadian energy community. We spoke with 11 industry organizations, 9 think tanks, NGOs, 11 regulators and governments, provincial and federal, and 7 Indigenous organizations. And we analyzed the interview data to identify convergences and divergences in people's perceptions and views. In other words, we were looking for the issues that interviews seem to be most agreed upon and the issues that they seem to be most divided about in their understanding of the transition language. So what did we find? We have a lot of data, so I can only focus on a few highlights here. On the use of the term transition, we found that more people than not use transition language. 21 people said they are using it, 15 said they're not, and a few were undecided. But those participants using the term say that they use it because it is accessible, it is familiar to the general public, and after all, everyone uses it. Those participants not using transition terminology say that it is too vague to be useful, it is politicized, it is only used by people with a certain ideology, it is overused and therefore empty. And specifically, many said that they don't use the term because they perceive it to exclude the fossil fuel sector from Canada's energy future. I want to zero in on one point, namely the lack of a universal definition of what transition means in the context of energy and climate change. And there was a general agreement among interviewers that such a definition is currently missing. However, there was disagreement over whether that vagueness is problematic or actually beneficial. A few people said that the vagueness of the term is beneficial as it allows people to come together and discuss, and so they perceive the vagueness as inclusive. However, the majority of people, namely 25, said that the vagueness of the term is problematic because it leads to misunderstanding, confusion, and ultimately inaction. Interestingly, a number of people who think the vagueness is a problem still use the term transition to talk about Canada's energy future. Let's turn to the meaning of the transition term. There was consensus on a few basic issues: the existence of climate change, Canada, the existence of effects or impacts on Canada, and also an agreement that Canada is currently in some kind of process of change in response to climate change. There was also agreement that transition generally refers to a process of change, broadly a change from state A to state B. But the divergences dominate. So interviewers strongly disagreed about the scope and the pace of these changes in Canada's energy economy and society in response to climate change. In other words, how far is the distance between state A and state B, and what should state B look like anyway, and how quickly should Canada move from A to B? The interviews revealed 2 ideal narratives about transition. And we're calling these narratives ideal in the sense that hardly any participant followed exactly one of the 2 narratives. However, participants generally find themselves closer to one narrative than the other. And searching for labels for the 2 narratives, what can we call them? We realized that both groups really would identify themselves as being the realists about what transition is and what it means for Canada. And so there was a widespread perception among participants that we lack honest conversations and we lack transparency about the realities of transition, except, of course, that they often had different realities in mind about which they felt Canadians needed to be more honest. So as a result, then, we labeled the 2 narratives Realism 1 and Realism 2. And I'm quickly going to walk you through them. So according to Realism 1 narrative, the scope of transition is fairly narrow. It should be focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And consequently, natural gas, if it is replacing coal, nuclear power, and carbon capture technologies, should all be part of Canada's energy portfolio going forward. And carbon capture in particular, together with other technological innovations in the oil and gas sector, is seen to slowly but surely decouple activity in the sector from GHG emissions. As a result, according to that narrative, Canada's oil industry should and will continue operations as long as there is domestic and international demand for Canadian oil. And as I said, emissions from the oil production and gas production can actually be reduced to zero at some point with the help of innovative technologies. And export of Canadian oil and gas is seen as beneficial to global emissions because Canada's fossil fuels have smaller carbon footprint compared to oil, for example, from other countries. With regards to the pace of the transition, Realism 1 says no rush. Rush leads to unreasonable decision-making and very high costs. So transition should rather and will occur within natural investment cycles. So that was Realism 1. We're now turning to Realism 2. And according to that narrative, transition is understood a lot more broadly. It should be concerned with lowering emissions, of course, but also with reducing other environmental impacts and with reforming political and economic systems around energy, including ownership structures, local and indigenous agency, and even beyond, looking at things like healthcare, democratic reform, reconciliation. The Realism 2 narrative also argues that Canada's oil industry should and will face a slow but certain phase out because, yes, climate change mitigation requires us to move away from oil, but also demand for Canadian oil will or is declining and will decline further in the future, both domestically and internationally, as world markets are perceived to not be willing to pay a premium for Canadian oil, and the argument that Canadian oil is cleaner or produced more responsibly is seen as merely an excuse for continuing business as usual in this sector. Regarding the pace of change, the Realism 2 narrative states that the emissions trajectory that should be targeted needs to be really determined by science, and in particular, the IPCC reports. So in short, again, coming back to that theme of realism, what do both narratives urge us to be realistic about? According to Realism 1, Canada needs to be realistic about the cost of transition. Fundamental change in Canada's energy system and economy is seen as costly and is taking a long time. And our lifestyle and quality of life is seen as being dependent on fossil fuel energy. People are seen to not be choosing the cleaner option if it is more expensive or less convenient for them. According to Realism 2, in contrast, Canada needs to be realistic about the devastating cost of climate change and the urgency to act. That narrative perceives global transition to happen and to pass by Canada if Canada doesn't react fast. And it is seen as a mistake for Canada to remain economically dependent on fossil fuels, on the fossil fuel sector, because people will demand change. So in conclusion, what can we say? Overall, the data indicate that participants perceive transition terminology as more polarizing than depolarizing. And still, we've seen the majority of participants indicate that they use this language when speaking about Canada's energy future. The data shows that language matters. Some participants feel excluded or judged by the transition terminology. Others feel that the term transition is a euphemism for the changes that Canada will have to go through. But the data also show that polarization and conflict is more than about semantics. There are substantive differences in the visions that people have about Canada's energy future and the realities that shape these visions. Multiple people pointed out that the lack of a shared vision of Canada's energy future, that's the underlying problem, not merely the language that we use to talk about this future. Maybe on the brighter side, many participants expressed the need for honest conversation about Canada's energy future, where people really listen to each other. And although, of course, their ideas of the realities that we need to be more honest about differ. So I hope that these insights have been useful to put polarization over Canada's energy future even more in perspective. And thank you for your attention. The full report for this study will be finalized and published in the coming months. Thank you so much. I hope you have an interesting and productive day ahead of you. Thank you.